Thanks very much for that introduction, Bastian, and can I too start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and I pay my respects to their elders both past and present. I want to thank Bastian and the College very much for inviting me here today. I also acknowledge my colleague, the Minister for Health, who's just left us now, but also the Greens spokesperson for Health, Richard Di Natale, who you'll hear from as well. It's very good to be here with you again at GP17. It's almost exactly a year since I joined you at GP16 in Perth, and at the time we had Susan Ley was Health Minister, and the Medicare rebate freeze was on all items until 2020. Now we have Greg Hunt as a Health Minister, and the Medicare rebate freeze is in place for many items until 2020. The fact that there has been some change in the government's policy settings over the last year is a testament to your advocacy, and I want to thank you for that. I know that campaigning alongside patients, and yes, alongside Labor, was not an action that you took lightly. As Bastian often reminds us, and has done so again this morning, the college is an academic medical college, not a lobby group. But your unprecedented campaign was made necessary by an unprecedented attack on Medicare. Your members and your patients needed the college to add its voice to the national debate, and you answered their call. Of course, the campaign by GPs, by patients and by Labor has not been as effective as we would have liked. I know the college tried to get a better agreement with the government, but in the end, Medicare rebates do remain frozen for years to come, for GP and specialist consultations until July 2018. For specialist procedures and allied health services until July 2019, and in a surprise not announced in the budget for around 120 other items until 2020. As you know, GP rebates were most recently indexed in July 2014, as the last Labor government had budgeted. That means the government's freeze will range from 4 years for some items to 6 years for others. Over the next 4 years alone, the ongoing freeze cuts $2.2 billion from Medicare rebates, which the government has banked as savings. That's $2.2 billion that is not available for longer GP consults, for reform in primary care. It's also $2.2 billion of downward pressure on bulk billing and upward pressure on out-of-pocket costs. It goes without saying that most GPs aren't happy with that outcome. The college's recent survey shows that 6 in 10 GPs are dissatisfied with the so-called resolution of the Medicare rebate freeze. In stark contrast, just 1 in 10 are satisfied. That's the same message I hear as I visit general practices across the country. I know that these comments are uncomfortable for some. I hear the call for bipartisanship in health. But bipartisanship only works when the policy settings are the right ones. I don't think Australians wanted Labor to reach across the aisle on the government's $7 GP tax or the privatisation of the Medicare payment system. And I don't think they wanted bipartisanship on $2.2 billion being cut from Medicare. We will work with the government where we can on Indigenous health, on global priorities like we talked about this week in the Parliament on polio eradication, and the MBS review and digital health where we support the outcomes, to name just a few. But we will continue to fight the government on health policy where we must. That is my job. And sometimes, unfortunately, it has to be yours. We are 18 months at most from the next election, although who knows what's going to happen with the High Court this afternoon. And therefore, the possibility, a very real possibility, of a Labor government. So I want to turn to Labor's views on primary care. Everyone in this room knows, but it is worth repeating at every single opportunity, that health systems with stronger primary care have better health outcomes. For 33 years, Medicare has provided the framework for such a system in Australia, with GPs at its centre. Medicare has given Australia one of the best healthcare systems in the world, at least according to the Commonwealth Fund. But Labor knows that our primary care system also faces unprecedented challenges. Out-of-pocket costs have become a significant barrier to access, When Australians are not bulk billed, they now pay an average of $36 to see a GP. And as a result of cost, over 800,000 people delay or avoid seeing a GP every year. Health inequalities are persistent. Of course, our starkest inequality is between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and the imminent 10-year anniversary of the Closing the Gap framework should give us all cause for pause. But other inequalities in both access to services and health outcomes also endure. As one example, people living in regional, rural or remote areas are 25% more likely to skip seeing a GP than those living in major cities. Our system is also straining under the weight of an ageing population and the chronic disease crisis. And as you know all too well, half of all Australians have a chronic disease and a quarter have 2 or more. We should be doing everything we can to turn that tide through promotion and prevention. But the reality is that some Australians will still need more care and different types of care. All of that calls for a reform agenda in primary care that goes well beyond the MBS review or the government's healthcare homes. I share, frankly, the college's scepticism about the healthcare homes trial. The government has said that it will revolutionise care, but it is asking general practices and Aboriginal medical services to lead the revolution without new investment. I don't think governments can ask the profession to do more with less, and nor does your President, who has called the healthcare homes a 2-year underfunded trial on the effects of inadequate capitation funding. The trial is too limited in its patient cohort and in its model. As you know, patients are not eligible for enrolment unless they already have 2 chronic conditions. I think we have to design new models of primary care to prevent chronic disease, not just treat it. And I particularly want to note the Productivity Commission report this week, which also made a point I've been making for some time. The benefit of integrated healthcare models are not just for patients with chronic disease, it's actually about the patients who are yet to develop chronic disease. It's in that preventative space where they will actually make the biggest difference. Obviously, the government has taken a decision to trial a very specific model that is largely being developed centrally. It may be one good model, but by being so prescriptive, we're not allowing providers to innovate in other ways and to test other models. Labor frontbenchers don't always agree with Productivity Commission reports, but as the Commission itself said about the healthcare homes trial this week, and I quote, "Fixed structures preclude decision makers from varying the categories and the payment structures that they find more effective. In any case, patients do not come in 3 sizes alone." The healthcare homes trial seems destined, unfortunately, I think, to join a litany of pilots in this space, including the coordinated care trials on which I worked back in the 1990s. Australia isn't lacking in pilots or ideas. As I visit general practices across the country, I hear and see lots of them. What we're lacking, frankly, I think, is a shared vision for primary care reform. And so I actually think we need to start from where we want to get to, by asking what do we need primary care to look like in 10 years' time? We all think that we know. My own personal view is that, and that has been led by many others as well, is that for more integrated care, for other specialists and allied health providers to be working and funded differently in a way that allows patient-centred care. But I want to acknowledge particularly that GPs are very advanced in your thinking on this. Your 2015 vision for general practice and a sustainable healthcare system remains one of the formative pieces of work in this space. But others have different ideas. As one example, many allied health professionals work alone or in small groups and rely on a mix of funding streams. Perhaps understandably, they are more focused on expanding access to MBS fee-for-service billing than they are on new models of care, but they're also integral to that care. So the first step does need to be a consensus statement across the breadth of interests. Once we've set agreed principles, we can then work backwards to map out how we'll get there, particularly in relation to funding models. We also need to acknowledge that strengthening primary care will take a decade. The reform journey will go beyond election cycles and, dare I say, beyond ministers and beyond governments. That calls for an architecture to embed reform into our primary care system. That's something that the last Labor government was working on via the COAG Health and Hospitals Reform Commission and the Primary Care Strategic Framework. It was also a focus of our policy at the last election. Amidst the rancour of the campaign, some of the detail, of course, always gets lost, so I want to reiterate some of that today. First, we did commit to reinvest any and all savings from the MBS review into innovation in primary care. And that's actually pretty critical, because one of the problems we've persistently had is that we trial models, but then the capacity to scale those models up and to roll those out right the way across the breadth of the system is always lacking, and it takes political will. You actually need to embed a system of innovation to actually roll those funding models out. If that is a bipartisan commitment and pending the outcomes of the review, it could mean significant funding for new models of primary care, and it would bolster the MBS review itself by ensuring that it is not seen as a cost-cutting measure. We need to be able to embed innovation into all that we do, as well as into the MBS review. Imagine a circumstance where in a local area, a group of general practices and allied health professionals and specialists are able to come up with a model that in fact saves the MBS and the PBS money. Imagine if we could reinvest that money and reinvest that shared savings into that new model. That would be a good way to go. Second, we recognise that new models of care require and do deserve new money. And so we committed in the election campaign an initial $100 million over 2 years to roll out new models of primary care, models plural, not one model simply designed in Canberra. Third, we would have established a Centre for Medicare Innovation within a permanent Australian Health Reform Commission. Unashamedly, our policy borrowed from the US Centres for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, with whom I've met. Creating an institutional home for innovation in payment models has worked well in the US and would work well here. In fact, Bastian's proposal of an independent medical authority is similar. That gives you a little bit of a sense of our thinking as of last year. But of course, we are actively refining our policies ahead of the next election. In March, we held a National Policy Summit in Canberra. It was attended by over 150 Australia's leading thinkers in health, including Bastian. The summit communique, which we've shared with the college, is an encapsulation of the needs and wants that exist across the entire health system. Of course, my job is to put flesh on those policy bones. We're doing that through a series of roundtables, for example, in Indigenous health, women's health, men's health, and so on. I thank the college has been represented at every one of those roundtables, and I thank them for it. The next stage in our policy process is to refine our national platform, which is our most important policy document. We will seek feedback on that existing platform shortly in the lead up to our national conference next year, and I welcome input from individual GPs as well as the college. I am very conscious of the time, and I do want to take as many questions as possible, but I want to finish where I started by thanking you for having me here today, thanking you for working with me on our platform, our election policies, and for the work that you do in primary care in Australia. But most of all, for thanking you for the care that you provide for millions of Australians every single day, year in, year out. Thank you. All right.
I mentioned to Catherine earlier today that her speech last year in Perth was actually one of my personal highlights, and I thought, you know, she probably can't top it today, but she just did, so thank you very much and well done.
Sweet. Thank you.
Catherine, we do have time for some questions, if that's
very
okay.
Happy to take them.
Michael.
Catherine, thank you. Michael Dasher, Western
Get the
Sydney.
microphone. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, Michael. We've met before.
We have. You will hear passionate advocacy on behalf of people who wish to reduce morbidity and mortality in single issues like obesity, like cancer, like cardiovascular disease, like hopelessness, like depression. I'm here to remind you that if you want to actually reduce the mortality and morbidity of all of those, simultaneously, we must reduce adverse child experience.
Yep.
President Trump is wrong, yet again, to say that the opioid crisis is the #1 public health issue in America. the number one public health issue in America and Australia is family violence and adverse child experience.
Great. Thank you very much, and I actually think that's a very timely reminder, and again, it goes right to the heart of, what are the issues in terms of broader population health. On the issue of family violence, Terry Butler is our Shadow Minister who's been doing a lot of work in this space, and I've actually just seen the framework that she's developed that she's putting to our Shadow Cabinet processes. One of those, obviously, is the role of general practice in assisting in family violence. And I hear from family violence prevention, I hear from a number of GPs about the struggle of actually, being able to recognise what's happening, being able to talk to patients about that, but also then having pathways for referral to actually be able to provide assistance. So we are doing some work very actively on that space at the moment, and I would welcome the college's input on that. We're pretty close to starting to finalise some of our policy positions on that. I think there's a lot of existing work that's been very good, but part of it is actually linking some of that up together. The other lovely advantage we've had very recently is that we have had enter into our parliament a paediatrician, Mike Freelander. I don't know if any of you have met him, but I'm sure that you have. We love him dearly, and we are delighted that he's in our caucus. He's been very, very strong on the first 1,000 days as a model for trying to deal with not just the access to services, but actually trying to provide a framework from which we actually build lifelong health. We're having a look at that. Of course, it's a challenging model to roll out everywhere, but the areas that I am very, very interested in is where there is the most disadvantage. How can we actually look at making sure that not just within Indigenous communities, but in those communities across the country, whether they're regional, rural, outer metropolitan, where persistent poverty, persistent indicators where we see that children being left behind, that we actually do with that. And there's some really good work. My colleague Jenny Macklin visited a fantastic clinic out in Mernda recently, where she's saying that real integration that's happening with education services, employment services, access to healthcare services and legal and justice services is actually the way to go. So actively thinking about it, it's my job to turn that into real policies and programs, but thank you.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. I'm Janie Maxwell. I'm one of the chairs of the Environmental Specific Interest Group at RSAGP. Thanks a lot for all your efforts. Now, there's obviously lots of health issues, but I think another pressing one is climate change and the risk it poses to our health systems and the health of Australians. What we'd like to see is RSAGP, and the AMA has also echoed this, is strong leadership from politicians as well as doctors on climate change mitigation and adaptation. The NHS in the UK are really leading this with a strong sustainable development unit, and I think that's something that, as a health minister, you could bring to the table, is to show our health systems how they can reduce their carbon footprint, protecting the health of Australians into the future, and also helping with strong climate change mitigation targets and bring health into that conversation. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I couldn't agree with you more, is basically the answer to that question. Mark Butler, who is our shadow spokesperson on the environment, and I committed that Labor would develop a climate change and health strategy based on the work that has already been done. I'm going to forget the name precisely of the group, but of the terrific work that has already been done and that was launched in Canberra just recently. I think that one of the really interesting things, and again talking to Mark about this, is when you look at sort of Obama's language around climate change, the way into that he used was very much around talking about the health impacts of that and starting to recognise that. And I think that's something we haven't done particularly well within this country, but Mark and I both recognise we do need a strategy. Of course, that's predicated on having a government that frankly believes in climate change and actually is going to do something about it. But that's certainly the commitment that we've made, and we did that about 6 months ago. But thank you for raising that with me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine. I do not believe we have time for further questions, but I'm wondering, are you staying around for
I'll
a little
stay
while?
around for a little while, obviously, to listen to my colleague Richard, but I'm very happy to try and take a couple of questions before I head home.
That's
so
great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Catherine.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you.